Hi there. In this video I want to tidy up some of the auth logic that I wrote in part 23. If you haven't seen that, please go ahead and watch part 23 of this video series. And let's get started. After implementing the auth flow in the previous video, I didn't have time to fix all the specs. Let's run them now and see what state they're in. So I'm just running rspec across the whole project, and you can see there are 3 failing tests. The first one is in the book spec. So I'll open up my editor, I'll open up VS Code, and we can go and look at the books controller spec. Books controller spec. Okay, and I'm going to run this file just because I can't remember which test was failing, and the failure is on line 39. Oops, sorry, that's the implementation in the spec, sorry. It's this test here which is failing. So we're testing post create, and we are making the call here, and you can see the error. It says JWT decode error, and you can see it's this line of code that the error is coming from. Now, there's 2 things that I notice about this failure. The first is the reason for the failure is because I'm not providing a JWT token. So I added authentication to certain endpoints, and it means one of those endpoints is the create action, and so it means I have to provide a JWT token. However, there's another thing I noticed, which is this controller shouldn't be raising an exception. If I call the controller without a JWT, it should fail gracefully and return a unauthorized status code rather than just returning an exception and blowing up. So we need to fix both of those issues. Let's fix this test first, and we'll worry about the graceful handling of a missing JWT later. So I could provide a JWT as a parameter. You can see I have the params here, and I could add a headers hash with a authentication token. However, these are controller tests, so they're relatively low level. And I think what I'll do instead is actually stub the service which does authentication. Here we only really care about the controller and what its controller action method is doing. So the authentication stuff happens in AuthenticationTokenService. And if you remember, this is called from the books controller. We have this authenticate user method. So we do before action, create and destroy. We call authenticate user, and that calls the authentication token service. What that does is we pass in a token, we call the decode method, and that returns a user ID. That user ID is then used to find a user. So what we could do is stub out that service altogether and just tell it to return a user ID, and that should satisfy the controller test. So let's jump back to the controller spec, and I'll add a before block, and inside I'll say allow the authentication token service to receive, decode, and return the user ID. And if I run this, let's see what happens. It should fail because user isn't defined. So I haven't defined a user in this test yet. I'll go ahead and do that now. So we can say user, I'll create it with factory bot, and I'll give it a password because that's the only required field for the user model. And now when I rerun everything, that test is now passing. So I think what we have here is quite nice. We're passing the test, we're stubbing out the authentication token service because that's tested elsewhere. And we still have our higher level tests where we don't stub out the authentication service and we test the whole thing with a real JWT token. Let's rerun all the tests to remind ourselves where the other failing tests are. As you can see, they're both in book spec. So let's jump over and take a look. The first one is this one on line 72. We say describe post books. We're trying to create a new book. And the failure, so it looks like we're already passing an authorization header. So it's not, the problem isn't with a missing authorization header. However, you can see that the book count hasn't changed. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. So let's jump into the authenticate user method. We'll put a binding IRB, which is a way that you can put a breakpoint into Rails. And I'll rerun the test and we'll see what's happening. So here we have the IRB prompt. We can see I have this token and options method, which takes the request. I'll have a look at what that does. So that's returning, seems to be correctly parsing out the token, which is what this line is for. And on the next one, we call AuthenticationTokenService and we pass in the token. That's giving us an ID of 1, so that's working. So now we have user ID being assigned the value 1, or the string 1 I should say, and then we call user find with that ID. Aha, so we can see active record not found, which means there isn't a user. If I do a user count, yeah, you can see there's no users in the database. So I should be able to fix this test pretty easily by creating a user. So we don't have a user anywhere else in here, but so certainly this test here, I'm going to add it here for now. This will require a user. So as I did before, factory bot create user with a password. And if I run this test again, we should hopefully see it passing. Oops, I left the breakpoints in. Let me jump over there and remove that. Okay, so we still have a failure. Let me do a let bang, because if I just use a let variable, the factory bot create won't actually be executed until I call user, because it's lazy loaded. If I add the bang, it's going to force the factory bot create to run and therefore create the user in the database straight away. So let's try that again. There we go, it's green. Okay, now this last test. Let's rerun all the specs. We should have a single failing test, which is this delete spec here. Now, if you remember, it was the create and the delete endpoints which require authentication. So you'll notice the test here, where we actually call the endpoint, is missing the authorization header. So what I'm going to do is steal this from here. And so we say post with params, and I'm going to add the header on here. Let's do it on a new line. So we have delete with the headers. So let's call that again. There we go. And now, So now we're actually calling it with the header. But now we get an error saying expected book count to have changed but did not, which I suspect is because we don't have a user. And just as we did before, I'm going to steal this line of code, and let's run that. There we go. So now we are passing in the right authorization header, and we have a user. So this bearer token is hard-coded to have an ID of 1, which matches because this is the only user in the database, that matches. So therefore the token is decoded, and then we find the user. Now let's go back to the second issue that we discussed at the start of this video. That is, the application should not be returning an exception if the authorization token is missing. It should be returning the correct status code to inform the caller that they're not authorized. So because it's only on certain endpoints, what I'll do for now is just add a new test into this this book spec, and I'll add it in the post books describe block. You could also go in the delete, but I'll put it here for now. So I'll add a new context and say missing authorization header, and let's say it should return a 401. So I'll do the post, as we do up here, API v1 books with params and headers. So I'll intentionally leave the headers hash empty, and the params hash doesn't actually matter. You can imagine that the user might fill params in but leave the authentication token out. However, like I said, it shouldn't matter because this is checked in a before action. So to keep the test simple, I'll just leave the params blank. And then we should say expect response to have HTTP status unauthorized. Let's run this test now. What we get is, instead of a nice 401 status code, we get an exception. So this test has correctly reproduced the behavior that we wanted it to. Now we need to fix it. Let's jump over to the books controller, and you can see we call the authentication token service here, and there's a rescue. So we rescue from active record not found. So if we can't find the user, we rescue that error and we render the unauthorized. But what we can do is add another case, because if the token's missing, we get this JWT decode error. So I can take that and add it as another exception that we rescue from. So if I save that and rerun the test, now it's green, because if the token's missing, we'll raise a JWT decode error from here. We'll rescue it and we'll render the correct status. Thinking about it, this test is actually quite low level, and I think it's more suited to living in the controller tests, because it is actually testing a controller method or behavior which is in the controller. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to open the books controller spec, and I'll paste it here as another context block inside the post create. Now I just need to change the syntax slightly, because this is a controller test rather than a more high-level integration test. So rather than specifying the endpoint in post, I specify the controller action name and the actual name of the method. Everything else can stay the same, I believe. Let's run the test and see what happens. We've got a failure, unknown keyword headers. Okay, actually I should be able to just remove this by calling it like this. Headers will be missing. There we go. So now we get param is missing, or the value is empty, author. Okay, so I do need. Oh, sorry, I see the problem here, because we're sharing the before action. So if I just comment this out for a second. What I can do here is add a context block around this test to say when authorization header present, and I'll move this inside there, and I'll move this before inside there as well. So the stub is only for the context of having the authorization header present. So now this test should be green, and this one should be green as well. There we go. And I can do the same for delete, because that also shares the same behavior of requiring an authorization header. We actually don't have a test for delete, so I'm going to add one. Let's add one now. So if I call delete destroy, so delete is the HTTP verb, destroy is the name of the controller action, and I can say context missing authorization header. And it should return a 401. So I call delete on destroy with some params. However, I'm not specifying any headers, and I'm not specifying a before action to stub out the authentication token service. So this test is essentially simulating a missing authorization header. We expect the response to have HTTP status unauthorized. There we go. Let's run the whole test suite to make sure everything is passing. And it is. Now there's one last thing I want to tackle before finishing this video, and that is inside the authentication token service. So we have these two methods. We have decode and we have call. And so there's a bit of inconsistency, because the idea of the call method is a Ruby service pattern where you have a service object which does one thing, and the class name describes it, and then the single public method is just call. So you could have a service called I don't know, increase book SKU, which kind of describes what the service does, and then the public method is just called call. So you have service name and you just have the call method. However, with our token service, it does make sense to have two entry points. We have a method for encoding and a method for decoding. So to cut a long story short, what we really want to do is rename call to encode. that fixes the inconsistency. We have two nice public interfaces. You can encode a token and decode a token. I'll run the tests now to see what's broken. And this is, as this project develops, we're kind of seeing the real benefits of testing. You can imagine if I didn't have this, I'd have to trawl through the code, maybe do some manual testing to figure out what's broken. But because we've got this really good test suite, I can just run them and see what's up. So we have a failure in the authentication spec. And it says undefined method call for authentication token service. So the other thing I can do is I can just say, I can look for, I can do a global search with VS Code or whatever editor you're using. And because this is a class method, we know to search for AuthenticationTokenService.call. This should now be in code. Run everything again. And we're almost green. Now we have the actual unit test for authentication token service. You can see there's a decode one here, and there's call up here, which should be in code. Hopefully, there we go. We're all green. Okay, I think we've really improved the code base here. There are a few more improvements I'd like to make, but I don't want to make this video too long. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you in the next one.